The Hawthorne Estate. Saturday, 4:58 p.m. The late afternoon sun hits the champagne flutes like shards of fire, and I am watching it all from a beat-up sedan parked 300 yards away. My name is Carol Ferguson, and technically, I'm not supposed to be here. Inside the gates, my brother is preparing to marry into a dynasty built on lies. Outside, I am holding the only wedding gift that matters, a manila envelope containing the forensic proof of his crimes. They uninvited me to save their image, but they forgot that you cannot erase someone who knows where the bodies are buried. Tonight the music stops. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Saturday, 4:58 p.m. The Hawthorne Estate. The late afternoon sun was hitting the limestone facade of the venue with that specific golden hour glow that wedding photographers would kill for. From where I sat, parked in my 10-year-old sedan 300 yards down the service road, the scene looked less like a celebration and more like a fortress intake. The valet line was a shimmering snake of German engineering black Mercedes S-Classes charcoal Range Rovers and the occasional vintage Porsche convertible. I watched men in tuxedos and women in silk slip dresses hand their keys to valets who moved with the frantic precision of pit crews. Champagne flutes were already circulating near the entrance, catching the light like little shards of fire. It was beautiful. It was expensive. And I wasn't supposed to be within 10 miles of it. I looked down at the passenger seat. There were two things sitting there. The first was my phone screen cracked at the corner, glowing dimly with 12% battery life. I kept tapping the screen to keep it awake, staring at the time as it ticked over to 4:59 p.m., acting like the device might physically explode if I let it go black. The second item was a standard 9x12 manila envelope. It wasn't thick, maybe 15 sheets of paper inside, but it had a gravitational pull that made the air in the car feel heavy. It was the only reason I was wearing a dress I couldn't really afford and heels that were already pinching my toes. I wasn't here to catch a bouquet. I was here to deliver a package. People like to think that families drift apart naturally, like tectonic plates moving imperceptibly over time. That's a lie people tell themselves to sleep better. Families don't erase you by accident. They do it on purpose, slowly, methodically, and then all at once. For the Ferguson family, the erasure had been a 20-year project, but the final coat of paint had been applied 3 weeks ago via a text message from my brother Blake. It hadn't been a conversation. It was a directive. You don't belong to this family anymore, Carol. Don't come. We'll have security. I watched a woman in a heavy emerald gown stumble slightly on the cobblestones before laughing, her head thrown back in manufactured joy. That was the world I had grown up on the periphery of. In the Ferguson house, there were two distinct roles cast at birth and enforced with iron discipline. Blake was the golden child, the charismatic son around which our parents Marianne and Richard happily orbited. He was loud, he was reckless, and he was undeniably charming in that dangerous way that lets boys get away with breaking things. I was the wreckage crew. I was the quiet one, the pragmatic one, the one who learned early that my role was to absorb the consequences of Blake's brilliance. The wound that finally severed us wasn't emotional. It was financial, and it was cold. 6 years ago, my grandmother, the only person in that bloodline who saw me as a distinct human being, passed away. She had often whispered to me about a trust, a modest safety net she'd set aside specifically for my law school tuition. She knew I wanted to be a lawyer. She knew my parents wouldn't pay for it because they were too busy leveraging their assets to float Blake's third failed entrepreneurial venture. When she died, I went to the bank with her death certificate ready to finally start my life. The account was empty. My father hadn't even blinked when I confronted him. He sat in his study surrounded by mahogany and the smell of expensive scotch and told me they had reallocated the funds. It was for the good of the family, Carol, he had said, using that tone that implied I was being selfish for even asking. Blake needed capital for a tech startup, a startup that predictably evaporated within 18 months, taking my future with it. That was the day I stopped being their daughter and started being their liability. I didn't scream, I didn't throw a vase. I just packed my bags, moved into a studio apartment the size of a closet, and got a job as a paralegal. Later, I moved into compliance analysis for a nonprofit. I didn't become a lawyer, but I became something more dangerous to people like them. I became someone who knows how to follow a paper trail. The inciting incident for today's nightmare had been a clerical error. A month ago, a digital invitation to Blake's wedding had landed in my inbox. It was a forwarded link, likely a mistake by the wedding planner's assistant, who had simply mass emailed everyone with the last name Ferguson in the contact list. For 10 minutes, I had stared at it, allowing myself a fantasy I knew was stupid. I thought maybe they had softened. Maybe the silence of the last few years had thawed them out. I clicked RSVP. Yes. I shouldn't have done it. I should have deleted it and gone back to my quiet, safe life. But the craving for connection is a sickness. 2 days after I clicked that link, I made the mistake of calling my mother. I just wanted to ask about the dress code. I wanted to hear her voice sound like a mother's voice. She answered on the second ring. Hello. Her voice was sweet, rehearsed the voice she used for neighbors and church friends. Hi, Mom. It's Carol. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut skin. The sweetness evaporated instantly, replaced by the frigid, controlled tone of a woman who views emotions as a weakness. We saw the RSVP, she said. No greeting, no question. I just thought, since I got the invite. I trailed off, feeling 12 years old again. We're not doing this today, Carol, she snapped. This wedding is about Blake's future. It is about the family's image. You are not part of that image. Do not make a scene. Do not show up. Then the line went dead. That call should have broken me. A younger version of me would have cried for a week. But the Carol sitting in this car wasn't 12. I was 28. I spent my days auditing corrupt organizations and tracing illicit funds. When my mother hung up, I didn't cry. I went to work. If they were so terrified of me making a scene, I needed to know why. It couldn't just be general distaste. You don't threaten security on your own daughter just because she's awkward at parties. You do it because she's a risk. I started digging. It didn't take long. Blake wasn't just getting married today. He was merging. He was marrying into the whitest, wealthiest, most politically connected family in the state. And to make himself look like a worthy suitor, my family had built a facade of wealth and stability that was held together by fraud. That was what lay inside the envelope on the passenger seat. I wasn't here to beg for a seat at the table. I wasn't here to ruin the cake cutting. I was here because the documents in that envelope proved that the wedding itself was a crime scene. Inside were trust statements, 3 vendor contracts, and a transcript of a voicemail I had legally recorded years ago but never used. They proved that Blake wasn't just a spoiled brat. He was laundering money through vendor accounts, using family connections to intimidate witnesses, and most damning of all, funding this $300,000 spectacle with money that didn't belong to him. My phone buzzed, dropping to 11%. I looked out the window. The sun was dipping lower. The ceremony was scheduled for 5:30 p.m. I had to time this perfectly. If I went in too early, security would bounce me at the perimeter. If I went in too late, the vows would be exchanged and the legal binding would be done. I needed to be inside during the transition in the chaos between the ceremony and the reception, when the guard was down and the liquor was flowing. My hands were shaking. I clenched them into fists on the steering wheel. The fear was physical, a cold knot in my stomach. I was one person against a dynasty. My father was a man who could talk his way out of a grand jury indictment. My mother could dismantle a person's self-esteem with a single compliment. Blake had the charm of a cult leader. They had money, they had the crowd, and they had the narrative. All I had was the truth, and in my experience, the truth was a flimsy shield against people with no shame. I checked the mirror. My makeup was simple, severe. I looked like myself, not the doll they used to dress up. I took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of old upholstery and nervous sweat. You can do this, I whispered. It sounded unconvincing in the empty car. Then movement in the rearview mirror caught my eye. A sleek black sedan, indistinguishable from the fleet of luxury cars at the valet stand, turned off the main highway and onto the service road. It didn't speed up to the valet. It slowed down, crawling toward my beat-up car with deliberate calm. It pulled up alongside me, the tires crunching softly on the gravel shoulder. The driver's side window rolled down smoothly. The man behind the wheel wasn't smiling. He didn't look like he was heading to a party. He was wearing a dark suit cut perfectly to his frame, but he wore it like armor, not a costume. His eyes met mine, steady and grounding, instantly quieting the static noise in my brain. He didn't look at the venue. He didn't look at the expensive cars or the security guards patrolling the gate. He just looked at me. Ethan Cross. He wasn't a savior. I didn't believe in those anymore. He was a witness. He was the one person in my life who knew the full story, the only one who had seen the receipts before today, and hadn't told me to let it go. He checked his watch, then looked back at me, giving a single, almost imperceptible nod. I grabbed the envelope. I grabbed my dying phone. I opened the car door and stepped out onto the gravel, the cool evening air hitting my face. Ethan killed the engine of his car and stepped out to join me. He adjusted his cuffs, his presence radiating a quiet, lethal competence that my family would never see coming. I looked at the gate, and that's when I realized, I thought the fear finally hardening into resolve, I wasn't walking in alone. The gravel crunched under my heels as I walked toward the entrance, the sound uncomfortably loud in the quiet lapses between the string quartet's distant melody. Ethan walked beside me, maintaining a precise distance close enough to be a presence far enough to let me own the space. That was the thing about Ethan. He wasn't a white knight. He didn't swoop in to rescue damsels. He backed up women who were already fighting. We had met 2 years ago in the most unromantic setting possible, a sterile conference room at a legal aid nonprofit where I was auditing compliance logs. He was a donor sitting quietly in the back while the board patted themselves on the back. I had been the one to stand up and point out a discrepancy in the fund allocation that everyone else was ignoring. Afterward, while the director glared at me, Ethan had approached. He didn't offer me a drink. He offered me a job reviewing contracts for his private holding company. He liked rigor. He liked truth. And over 2 years, consultant had turned into coffee, which turned into dinner, which turned into the only relationship in my life that didn't feel like a transaction. He knew about my family, not the sob story version, but the forensic version. He knew the debts, the lies, and the emotional blackmail. And unlike everyone else who told me to just forgive them for your own peace, Ethan had looked at the spreadsheet of my life and said, "You need leverage." As we neared the massive wrought iron gates of the Hawthorne estate, the reality of the obstacle ahead sharpened. There were 2 security guards, thick-necked men in ill-fitting blazers holding clipboards. They weren't checking invitations. They were checking faces. My stomach dropped. I knew with the sickening certainty of a scapegoat that my photo was on that clipboard. My mother was thorough. She wouldn't just rely on a verbal warning. She would have supplied a visual aid to ensure I was humiliated before I even crossed the threshold. I slowed down my grip on the envelope, tightening until the edges bit into my palm. "They have a picture," I murmured, barely moving my lips. Ethan didn't break stride. "I know. Keep walking. Shoulders back." I forced myself to breathe. This was part of the plan. I wasn't here to cause a scene at the gate. I was here to deliver evidence. The envelope in my hand contained the why behind this wedding. It wasn't love. It was laundering. My brother Blake had set up a shell company, Apex Consulting, 3 years ago. Through my work as a compliance analyst, I'd found the crossover. Blake was billing his own vendors, florists, caterers, venue managers through Apex, inflating costs by 40% and pocketing the difference to pay off gambling debts. But he had gotten sloppy. The latest invoices were being paid directly by his future father-in-law's corporation, listed as merger expenses. If this wedding happened, the in-laws wouldn't just be family. They would be accessories to fraud. I wasn't here to ruin a party. I was here to stop a felony that was being funded by my grandmother's stolen trust money. We reached the front of the line. The lead guard looked up, his eyes bored and scanning. He looked at me, then looked down at his clipboard. I saw his eyes widen slightly. He had found the match. He opened his mouth, his hand raising to block my path. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to—" Then he saw Ethan. Ethan hadn't said a word. He just adjusted his cuff, the Rolex on his wrist, catching the light, and looked the guard dead in the eye. It wasn't a look of aggression. It was a look of absolute, terrifying authority. Ethan Cross was the CEO of Cross Logistics, a company that likely employed the security firm this guard worked for. He didn't need to flash a badge. He just needed to be seen. The guard's throat worked as he swallowed the words he was about to say. The recognition was instant, not of a celebrity but of power. You don't stop a man who looks like he owns the building, and you certainly don't stop his guest. "Good evening, sir," the guard stammered, stepping back and unclipping the velvet rope. "Right this way." He didn't look at me again. He didn't check the list. The fear of misstepping in front of a shark outweighed the orders from a goldfish like my brother. "It wasn't respect," I whispered to Ethan as we passed through the archway. "It was fear." "Whatever works," he replied softly. "We're inside. You have the floor." The venue was a sensory overload of wealth. The garden was draped in white orchids, thousands of them. A string quartet played Taylor Swift covers near a champagne fountain. The guests were a mix of old money and new tech people who held glasses of Prosecco like weapons. I scanned the crowd, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I saw them immediately. My family was holding court near the open bar. My mother, Marianne, looked regal in silver silk, laughing at something the bride's mother said. My father, Richard, was clapping a senator on the back. And Blake was glowing. He looked every inch the golden boy, his tuxedo tailored to hide the softness of a life without manual labor. He was selling the lie perfectly. I felt a vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone. A text from Mom sent 2 minutes ago. "If you are on the property, your father will call the police. Don't test us." I deleted it. I wasn't testing them. I was grading them. "I need to do this part alone," I told Ethan. This was one of my rules. If he stood next to me while I confronted them, they would dismiss me as a woman hiding behind a man. They needed to see that I stood on my own 2 feet. Ethan nodded. "I'll be at the perimeter. If security moves on you, I step in. Otherwise, it's your play." He drifted toward a group of investors he recognized, blending seamlessly into the power dynamic of the room. I took a deep breath, clutched the envelope against my side, and walked straight toward the bar. The air seemed to cool as I approached. It was a physical sensation, a drop in pressure. My mother saw me first. Her smile didn't drop. It froze. The skin around her eyes tightened, transforming her expression from joy to a rictus of panic. She tapped my father's arm. He turned, his face darkening instantly. Blake followed their gaze, and for a second, I saw pure, unadulterated hatred flash across his face, before he masked it with a smirk. They maneuvered toward me, cutting me off before I could reach the main crowd. They cornered me near a trellis covered in ivy, a secluded spot meant for romantic photos now serving as an interrogation room. "Look at you," my mother hissed, her voice low and venomous. She scanned my dress, a simple navy A-line I'd bought on sale, with a sneer. "You couldn't even stay away. You just had to have a slice of the attention, didn't you?" "I'm not here for attention, Marianne," I said, keeping my voice level. I refused to call her mom. "I'm here to give Blake a wedding gift." I held up the envelope. Blake laughed, a sharp barking sound. He stepped into my personal space, looming over me. He smelled of expensive cologne and scotch. "What is it, a gift card to Applebee's? That's about all you can afford on your little paralegal salary, right?" "It's compliance analysis, Blake. And it pays enough to buy internet access, which is how I found the public records for Apex Consulting." The name landed like a physical blow. Blake's smirk faltered. My father stepped in, using his physical bulk to shield Blake, instinctively protecting the asset. "You're not family," my father growled, his face turning a mottled red. "You're a liability. You always have been." You think you can walk in here with your conspiracy theories and ruin this security is on the way. Let them come, I said, my voice shaking slightly, but holding firm. I'd love to show them the wire transfer records where Blake moved $40,000 of the wedding fund into an offshore sports betting account. I'm sure his new father-in-law, Mr. Sterling, would find that fascinating. Isn't he on the board of the bank that flagged the transaction? My mother grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my flesh. You hold your tongue. We did everything for you. We put a roof over your head. We tolerated your moods, your failures. And this is how you repay us. By trying to destroy your brother's happiness because you're jealous. I'm not jealous, I said, pulling my arm free. I'm terrified. Because when this house of cards falls, I don't want to be the one underneath it. I'm giving you a chance. Call off the merger. Tell Mr. Sterling the finances need to be restructured. Do it quietly tonight, or I give this envelope to him before the cake is cut. Blake leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. You won't do it. You're a coward, Carol. You always fold. You'll leave, you'll cry in your car, and tomorrow you'll send an apology text. That's who you are. That's why you're alone. Who'd you bring anyway, your manager? Some loser from the temp agency. He looked past me, scanning the crowd, but Ethan was nowhere to be seen. Blake laughed again. Phantom boyfriend. Classic Carol. Ladies and gentlemen. The DJ's voice boomed over the speakers. Please find your seats. The toasts are about to begin. My father glared at me. Sit at the back. Don't speak. If you stand up, I will have you dragged out in handcuffs. I mean it. They turned their backs on me, a unified wall of denial, and walked toward the head table. I was left standing by the trellis, shaking. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of restraint. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the tablecloths down, but I remembered my rules. No screaming, no physical retaliation. I walked to the back of the room. I didn't sit. I stood near a pillar obscured by a large floral arrangement. I needed to wait. A waiter passed by with a tray of wine. He saw my face, likely pale eyes wide, and paused. He was young, maybe 20, with a kind, tired face. You okay, miss? He asked quietly. I'm fine. I lied. You look like you need this more than the guests, he said, sliding a glass of water onto the small table next to me. Hang in there. Weddings are hell. It was a small moment, but it grounded me. It reminded me that the people serving the food were more my family than the people eating it. Community wasn't blood. It was the people who stopped to ask if you were okay. I took a sip of water. I remembered the American value I actually lived by, the one my parents preached, but never practiced: freedom. Freedom means you get to leave. But first you have to make sure the truth stays behind. The speeches began. The best man told a raunchy story that was polished to be safe. The maid of honor cried. Then Blake took the microphone. He stood in the center of the dance floor, bathed in a spotlight. He looked perfect. He looked like a CEO. He looked like a lie. Thank you all for coming, Blake said, his voice smooth as silk. It means the world to us. We have so many friends and family here, and we have some family who couldn't be here. He paused, letting a somber silence fill the room. He looked directly at the back of the room, directly at where I was standing in the shadows. My sister Carol struggles with a lot, he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. She has some challenges with reality. It's been hard on our parents. We love her, but sometimes love means keeping a distance, so everyone stays safe. So if you see her tonight, please just be kind. She doesn't always know what she's doing. A murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Poor Blake. Such a good brother, dealing with an unstable sister. The humiliation washed over me like ice water. It was brilliant. It was evil. He was inoculating the crowd against me. If I spoke up now, I wasn't a whistleblower. I was the crazy sister he had warned them about. He had weaponized my silence. He had taken my boundaries and painted them as insanity. My mother dabbed a fake tear from her eye. My father nodded solemnly. They had won. They had rewritten the narrative in real time. I looked down at the envelope. It felt heavy, useless. If I walked up there now, security would tackle me before I got a word out, and everyone would applaud them for restraining the unstable woman. I felt the urge to run, to just leave and never come back. Blake was right. I was going to fold. Then the air in the room changed. It started at the front near the VIP tables. A ripple of movement, heads turning, whispers spreading like wildfire. I looked toward the source of the disturbance. Ethan was walking across the dance floor. He wasn't walking toward me. He was walking toward the head table. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely at ease, his hands in his pockets, strolling as if he were walking through his own living room. But the effect he had on the room was magnetic. A man at table 4, the vice president of the bank that held Blake's loans, stood up abruptly. Is that Ethan Cross?" Someone whispered loudly enough to Carrie. "The logistics guy. The one who bought out Meridian. What is he doing here?" Blake froze. The microphone dipped in his hand. He didn't know who Ethan was by face, but he knew the reaction of the wealthy men in the room. He saw the shift in status. Ethan stopped 10 feet from the head table. He didn't take the microphone. He didn't need to. He just turned, looked directly at me in the back of the room, and waited. He was ceding the floor. He was using his gravity to pull every single eye in the room away from the golden child and toward the crazy sister. My mother's face changed first. I saw the calculation happen in slow motion. She looked at Ethan, then at the men standing up to get a better look at him, then back at me. She realized in that second that I had brought something far more powerful than a date. I had brought credibility. That's when they started acting like they'd loved me all along, I thought, watching my father's posture stiffen. But it was too late for that. The spotlight hadn't moved, but the attention had. The silence in the room wasn't respectful anymore. It was expectant. They were waiting to see what the woman in the shadows would do. I stepped out from behind the pillar. I walked into the light. I wasn't the crazy sister anymore. I was the one holding the envelope. The walk from the shadows of the pillar to the center of the dance floor felt longer than the drive to the venue. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the distinct rhythmic click of my heels on the polished parquet. I didn't rush. Rushing looks like panic. Walking slowly looks like inevitability. Every eye in the room was fixed on me, some confused, some pitying. But the ones that mattered, the ones at the head table, were wide with a primal kind of terror. Blake was still holding the microphone, his knuckles white against the black plastic. He looked like a deer caught in headlights if the deer was wearing a $3,000 tuxedo and had just accused his sister of being mentally unstable. As I reached him, he didn't move to hand it over. He just stared, his smile twitching, trying to maintain the frame he had built. "Carol," he whispered, barely audible without the amplification. "Don't do this. I'll ruin you." I reached out and took the microphone from his hand. He didn't fight me for it. He couldn't. To wrestle the microphone away from his fragile sister would look violent. He had to let me speak. He had to trust that his character assassination had been thorough enough to make anything I said sound like the ravings of a jealous failure. I turned to the crowd. I saw the faces of the elite judges, investors, the Sterling family. I saw Ethan standing near the edge of the floor, his hands still in his pockets, watching me with that steady, anchoring gaze. He wasn't going to save me. He was waiting to see if I could save myself. "Blake is right," I said. My voice was steady, magnified by the speakers filling the cavernous room without a tremble. I do struggle with reality. Specifically, I struggle with the version of reality my family has invented to sell you all on this merger. I paused. A few people shifted in their seats. My father started to stand up, his face a mask of fury, but my mother yanked him back down, whispering furiously. She thought she could wait me out. She thought I would ramble and cry. "I'm not here to ruin a wedding. I continued reaching into my purse and pulling out the envelope. I opened the clasp slowly. The sound of the paper tearing was sharp in the silence. I'm here because I work in compliance, and when I see a discrepancy, I document it. You've all been told that this wedding cost $300,000. You've been told it's a celebration of success. But the money didn't come from success. It came from erasure. I pulled out the first document. It was a bank statement enlarged and highlighted. 3 months ago, a trust fund established by our grandmother intended for education was liquidated. The signature authorizing the withdrawal is mine. I held the paper up, but I didn't sign it. My brother Blake traced my signature from a birthday card. That is called forgery. It is a felony. And that $40,000 paid for the flowers you are all smelling right now. A gasp rippled through the room. Not a polite gasp, but a shocked, ugly sound. Blake took a step toward me. "She's lying," he shouted, his voice cracking. "She's off her meds. Someone get her out of here." "I have the bank's affidavit confirming the signature mismatch right here," I said, pulling out the second sheet. "And I have the wire transfer records. But that's small change compared to Apex Consulting." I turned to look directly at Mr. Sterling, the bride's father. He was a hard man, a man who ran a global shipping empire. He wasn't looking at me with pity anymore. He was looking at me with the cold, hard stare of a businessman who realizes he's bought a lemon. "Mr. Sterling," I said, keeping my voice professional, "you believe your company paid a consulting firm called Apex for merger logistics. You didn't. You paid a shell company registered to a P.O. box in Blake's name. The invoices you paid, totaling $112,000, went directly into the venue's account to pay for the catering and the band." I held up the articles of incorporation for Apex Consulting. "This isn't a wedding," I said, looking back at the crowd. "This is a money laundering operation, and every single one of you is a prop." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was vacuum-sealed. The air had been sucked out of the room. This wasn't a drunk sister making a scene about not being a bridesmaid. This was forensic. This was specific. This was undeniable. My father couldn't take it anymore. He shoved his chair back, the legs screeching against the floor. "That is enough," he roared, marching toward the stage. "Security! Get this woman out of here now! She is slandering my son!" 2 security guards started to move from the perimeter. They were big men paid to handle drunks, not whistleblowers. I felt a spike of fear, physical fear. If they touched me, if they dragged me out, the narrative might shift back. It would become a physical altercation, and in a fight, the crazy person always looks crazier. But they didn't get to me. Ethan stepped forward. He didn't run. He just placed himself between the guards and the dance floor. He held up one hand, palm out. "I wouldn't," Ethan said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The guards stopped. My father stopped. "Who do you think you are?" My father spat, his face purple. "My name is Ethan Cross," he said calmly. "And my legal team has already forwarded digital copies of every document Carol is holding to the district attorney's office. The fraud unit has them. So does Mr. Sterling's board of directors." He looked at my father, then at Blake. "You can drag her out," Ethan said, "but you can't drag the PDF out of the DA's inbox. It's over." The weight of his words crashed down on the room. The truth drop was complete. It wasn't just that I had exposed them, it was that I had ensured the exposure. The twist wasn't the fraud. The twist was that I had anticipated their reaction. I knew they would try to silence me, so I had made sure the silence wouldn't matter. I looked at Blake. He had collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. The bride was standing 10 feet away from him, looking at him like he was a stranger. Mr. Sterling was on his phone, likely calling his CFO. The wedding wasn't paused, it was dead. But I wasn't done. There was one last thing, the personal cost. The reason why this wasn't just about money. I held the microphone up one last time. "You told everyone I was unstable," I said to my mother, who was sitting stone still, her face pale as ash. "You told them you tried to help me. You told them you loved me." I pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen. I held the speaker up to the microphone. The audio quality was clear. It was a voicemail from 2 years ago, the day I had asked for help with my rent, after I lost my job due to the layoffs. Carol, stop calling us. My mother's voice rang out, distorted, but unmistakable. We don't care if you lose the apartment. Honestly, it would be better if you just disappeared. You're an embarrassment. Blake is the future. You're just waste. Do not contact us again until you have something to offer. The recording clicked off. The cruelty of it hung in the air. It wasn't the cartoonish villainy of a soap opera. It was the banal, exhausted cruelty of a parent who simply didn't love one of her children and was tired of pretending. I looked at the crowd. There were no whispers now. There was only the horrific realization that they were witnessing the autopsy of a family. I tried to handle this privately, I said, my voice dropping to a normal volume, intimate and tired. I sent emails. I asked for a meeting. I just wanted the money back that Grandma left me. I just wanted an apology. Instead, you invited me here to humiliate me. You used your own wedding as a trap to discredit me so I couldn't sue you. I looked at my father, who was standing impotently by the edge of the dance floor, blocked by Ethan's silent vigil. For the first time in my life, I said, you couldn't rewrite me in real time. You couldn't edit this out. I walked over to the edge of the stage. I placed the microphone gently on the floor. I didn't throw it. I treated it with care because I was the only adult in the room. I looked at Blake one last time. He wasn't the golden child anymore. He was just a fraud in a rented suit. I'm done negotiating for basic decency, I said, speaking to the silence, knowing they could hear me. And you don't get to call it love when it's control. I turned my back on them. I didn't wait for applause. There wouldn't be any. This wasn't a movie where the hero gets a standing ovation. This was a demolition. It was messy, and it was painful, and it was absolutely necessary. I walked toward Ethan. He didn't smile. He just nodded, turned, and fell into step beside me. As we walked toward the exit, the sound of the world rushing back in, began the shouts of Mr. Sterling, the sobbing of the bride, the frantic excuses of my father. But it sounded distant, like noise coming from a television in another room. I kept walking. I didn't look back. The walk from the dance floor to the exit was less than 50 feet, but in that short distance I heard the room fracture. It wasn't a clean break, it was a crumbling. Behind me, the silence I had commanded was replaced by a chaotic swarm of noise. I heard the sharp click of camera shutters. Guests were no longer respecting the no phones policy. They were documenting the disaster. I heard Mr. Sterling's voice booming, demanding answers from a cowering wedding planner. I heard the distinct sound of someone weeping in the bathroom hallway. The illusion of the Ferguson dynasty hadn't just cracked. The foundation had liquefied. I reached the double doors, my hand pressing against the cool brass bar to push them open, when I heard the rapid staccato of heels on marble behind me. I knew who it was before I turned. Carol, Carol, wait. It was my mother. She had actually sprinted to catch me before I breached the perimeter of the ballroom. She wasn't screaming. She was breathless, her eyes darting around to see who was watching. When she reached me, she didn't strike me. She didn't scowl. She opened her arms. "Oh, honey," she breathed, her voice pitched high and trembling loud enough for the people near the coat check to hear. "You're so upset. Come here. Let's go to the bridal suite and talk this out. We can fix this." It was the damage control hug. It was a tactical maneuver she had used 1,000 times to smother dissent with performative affection. If I let her hug me, the narrative shifted again. It would look like a family reconciliation, a misunderstanding smoothed over by a mother's love. The guests would think, "See, they're hugging." It wasn't that serious. I stepped back. The movement was small, but it was a rejection so absolute it felt like a slap. "Don't touch me," I said. My voice was low for her ears only. "The show is over, Marianne. You don't have an audience anymore." Her arms dropped. The mask slipped instantly. The concern vanished, replaced by a cold reptilian calculation. "You have no idea what you've done," she hissed, stepping into my personal space. "You've destroyed everything. Blake Steele. Your father's reputation. For what? For $40,000. We could have paid you back. It wasn't a loan, I said, looking her dead in the eye. And you never would have paid it back. You would have just taken more. Before she could respond, the doors burst open again. This time it wasn't a tactical approach. Blake shoved through his face, flushed a blotchy red, his tie undone. He looked deranged, stripped of the golden aura that usually protected him. He didn't care who was watching. "You bitch!" he screamed, lunging toward me. Ethan moved instantly. He didn't touch Blake. He just stepped into the space between us, a solid wall of charcoal wool. Blake skidded to a halt, panting, his hands balling into fists. "You think you won?" Blake spat, pointing a shaking finger at me over Ethan's shoulder. "You think anyone cares about your little receipts? You're nothing. I took that money because I needed it, because I'm the one actually doing something with my life, not filing paperwork in a cubicle. Grandma would have given it to me anyway." There it was, the final confirmation. He didn't deny the theft, he justified it. He truly believed that my existence was secondary to his ambition. The guilt I had been carrying, the tiny nagging fear that maybe I was being too harsh, evaporated. "She didn't give it to you, Blake," I said, feeling a strange, hollow calmness. "And neither did I." We pushed past them through the doors and out into the cool night air. The humidity of the ballroom was gone, replaced by a sharp breeze that felt like scrubbing my skin clean. The valet stand was chaotic, but not with arriving guests. People were leaving. I saw the Sterlings, the bride's parents, storming toward their limousine. Mr. Sterling was on his phone barking orders. "Get legal on the line, now. I want the merger halted. I want a forensic audit of every dime we sent that kid, and get the police on the line regarding the fraud." The perfect story hadn't just ended. It was being legally dismantled in the parking lot. The wedding was collapsing in real time. I walked toward the edge of the driveway, away from the lights, needing a moment to breathe. A heavy door clicked open behind us. I flinched, expecting security, but it was Mrs. Alvarez, our old neighbor from when I was 10 before we moved to the big house. She was clutching her purse, looking out of place in her Sunday best. She walked up to me, her eyes wet. She didn't look at the venue, she looked at me. "I heard you, mija," she whispered. She reached out and squeezed my hand. Her skin was rough, warm. "I remember when you were little. You were always the one fixing things they broke. You did good today. You did good." I felt a lump rise in my throat, the first real emotion I'd felt in hours. That was the community I had chosen. Not the people with the titles, but the people who remembered the truth. "Thank you, Mrs. Alvarez," I choked out. "Go," she said, nodding toward where Ethan was pulling the car up. "Don't look back at that house. There's nothing in there for you." I got into the passenger seat of Ethan's car. The leather was cool. The engine hummed with a quiet, reliable power. As we pulled away, I watched the Hawthorne estate recede in the side mirror. I saw blue lights flashing in the distance, police likely called by Mr. Sterling, not my father. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel like laughing. Revenge didn't feel like fireworks or a parade. It felt like the moment after a fever breaks. It felt like quiet oxygen. I was tired, bone-deep tired, but for the first time in 28 years, I wasn't carrying their weight anymore. I was just carrying myself. "You okay?" Ethan asked, his eyes on the road. "No," I said honestly, leaning my head against the window. "But I will be." We didn't go to a fancy restaurant to celebrate, and we certainly didn't go to a club. We went to the one place where I felt like I actually owned the ground beneath my feet, my apartment. It was a third-floor walk-up in a neighborhood my mother would have called transitional, and my father would have called sad. But as I unlocked the door and stepped onto the cheap laminate flooring, it felt like a sanctuary. I kicked off my heels immediately, letting them clatter against the wall. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the tap, and splashed cold water on my face, scrubbing away the makeup and the lingering feeling of the Hawthorne estate's air conditioning. When I looked up at my reflection in the mirror, I expected to see someone broken or exhausted. Instead, I saw someone familiar. I saw the girl who had survived. Ethan was out on the small balcony that overlooked the alleyway. He had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, leaning against the railing with a beer he'd pulled from my fridge. I joined him, the night air filled with the sounds of the city sirens, distant traffic, the hum of a neighbor's TV. It wasn't the polite silence of the wealthy, it was the noisy, messy sound of real life. "You okay?" he asked again. He wasn't hovering. He was just checking the structural integrity of the situation. "I think so," I said, leaning next to him. "I feel lighter. Is that terrible? I just dismantled my brother's life and I feel relieved." "You didn't dismantle his life," Carol, Ethan said, taking a sip of his beer. "You just turned on the lights. If the room was dirty, that's not the fault of the light switch." I looked out at the skyline. For years I had defined myself by my deficit, by the love I didn't get, the money that was stolen, the seat at the table I was denied. I had chased their approval like a dog chasing a car, thinking that if I just achieved enough or stayed quiet enough, they would finally see me. But tonight, I realized I had outgrown the need for them to see me. I saw myself. I thought about the American values my father loved to preach about during Thanksgiving dinners. He talked about resilience, but he meant stubbornness. Real resilience was surviving the story your family wrote for you and writing your own over the top of it. He talked about community, but he meant a country club. Real community was Mrs. Alvarez gripping my hand in the parking lot. It was the people who showed up when the blood relatives didn't. And freedom. Freedom wasn't having enough money to buy a senator. Freedom was the ability to walk away from a burning building and know you didn't have to carry the ash with you. "I chose my life," I whispered almost to myself. "And no one gets a vote anymore." Ethan set his beer down on the rusted metal table. He turned to face me fully. The mood shifted, not into high drama, but into a deep gravitational seriousness. He didn't get down on one knee. That would have felt performative, like the wedding we had just left. He just stood there, eye to eye with me, an equal partner. He reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull out a ring box yet. He just held my gaze. "I watched you tonight," he said quietly. "I watched you stand there, while they threw everything they had at you, and you didn't flinch. I don't want a partner who needs saving, Carol. I want a partner who knows how to stand her ground." He took a breath. "I won't ask you to forgive them," he said, and the relief that washed over me at those words was physical. "I know what they did. I know who they are. I'm not asking for peace with them. I'm asking if you'll build with me on truth. No hidden accounts, no secret narratives, just us building something real." He pulled out a simple band, white gold, no massive diamond to catch the light, just clean, solid metal. It was perfect. I looked at him. I didn't say yes because he had money, or because he was handsome, or because I wanted a wedding to rival Blake's. I said yes because for the first time in my life, I was looking at a man who saw me as an asset, not a liability. I felt safe. "Yes," I said. "Let's build." Later that night, sitting on my couch, I pulled my phone out one last time. The notifications were a solid wall of text. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in 5 years were demanding explanations. My father had sent 12 missed calls. My mother had sent a stream of texts that oscillated between begging and threatening. The family group chat titled Ferguson Family Events was exploding with speculation and fallout. I didn't read them. I didn't reply. I opened the settings menu, scrolled to the bottom, and hit Leave Group. Then I blocked the numbers. One by one. Mom, Dad, Blake, silence. I opened my wallet and pulled out the one thing I had kept from the old house. It was a small, creased photo of me at age 6 sitting on a swing set, smiling with a missing front tooth. It was taken before the money troubles, before the roles were cast, before I became the scapegoat. I looked at that little girl. She looked happy. She looked free. I propped the photo up on the coffee table. They wanted a drama-free wedding. What they got was a life I'm finally free to live. And so Carol closed the final chapter on the family, who tried to erase her, finally stepping into a future built entirely on the truth. If you enjoyed this story of high-stakes revenge and accountability, Please hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime and deeply personal conflict stories. We read every single comment of your thoughts on Carol's choices and her powerful exit. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.